"Mom, this apartment is going to be ours." My son said that while I was still sitting in my own living room. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a declaration. I looked straight at him, and instead of crying or fighting back, I simply stood, closed the door, turned the lock, and let him pound on it, shouting, "Selfish." The apartment was so quiet I could hear the rush of blood in my ears. In that silence, I understood the boy I had raised no longer saw me as his mother, only as an obstacle standing between him and what he wanted. Before I go further, let me ask you, what would you do if your own family suddenly turned against you, treating you like a burden? Share your thoughts below in the comments. And if you're watching this from Boston, New York, Dallas, or anywhere else, let me know your city. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. My name is Martha Henderson. I'm 67 years old, a retired school librarian, and I've been a widow for over a decade. I live alone in an old red brick apartment in Boston. To others, it's just a small 2-bedroom, creaking wooden floors, a balcony barely big enough for 2 chairs. But to me, it's sacred ground, our wedding photo with Frank, my late husband, his old journals, the scratches on the kitchen counter from family dinners years ago. Every corner holds a soul, every detail breathes with memory. And yet my son Eric sees it only as property to be claimed. I remember his eyes that day, cold, calculating, as if I were nothing more than an old woman rattling around in too much space. His wife Angela had long been planting seeds, with her fake compliments calling my curtains vintage charm, then suggesting the kitchen be knocked down, the walls opened. I laughed it off, but when Eric spat the word selfish at me after a lifetime of sacrifice, it was like a hammer blow straight to my chest. I leaned back against the door I had just locked. My breath was ragged, my hands icy. Part of me longed to fling it open, to scream, to hurl his cruelty back at him. But another voice, softer yet stronger, whispered, "No, stay silent. Let him face the emptiness he created." That silence became my first act of defiance. The little boy who once clutched my hand across snowy Boston streets was gone. In his place stood a man who measured square footage before love, inheritance before memory. The pain was searing, but beneath the ashes, a spark flared resolve. That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table, a cooling cup of chamomile tea in my hand, the light casting shadows on the lace curtains Frank had bought in New Orleans. I thought about that word, selfish. Maybe Eric was right, but not in the way he imagined. Maybe for once I needed to be selfish enough to save what was left of me, and silence, no longer surrender, became the beginning of my war. Silence may have been my first weapon, but silence cannot feed you. Life carries on, and the very next Sunday I found myself setting the table for dinner just as I had done for decades. It should have been ordinary roast chicken, green beans, cornbread warming in the oven. But beneath the smells of butter and garlic, there was something rancid in the air, something no candle could mask. Eric arrived late as usual, his phone glued to his ear, the language of contracts spilling from his lips as though he were auditioning for an audience I could not see. Angela followed a step behind, immaculate in her wine-colored dress, her nails painted a shade too sharp, too pointed like little weapons. And then Lily, only 9, bounding in with her tangled hair and mismatched socks, her laughter a sound I wanted to clutch and never release. We sat. Angela complimented the curtains. "So classic," she said, tilting her head with that smile that never touched her eyes. Of course, I'd go with something lighter, maybe linen. "And the walls, don't you think white would make the space more open?" I nodded politely, though each word landed like a pinprick. The curtains were not just fabric. Frank had chosen them on a trip to New Orleans, teasing me until I laughed so hard I agreed. His voice still lived in those folds. Angela couldn't see that. Or maybe she could, and that was exactly why she wanted them gone. Dinner carried on, but I could feel the edges of my patience fray. Eric carved the chicken, served it with a flourish, then leaned back with a glass of Cabernet he hadn't paid for, hadn't lifted a hand to earn. Angela praised the oak cabinets, but added, "Of course they'd look even better if we opened up the kitchen, knocked down that wall." I forced myself to breathe. Their suggestions weren't suggestions at all. They were rehearsals, plans spoken aloud in my presence as though I were already erased. And then Lily, with all her innocence, asked the question that sliced me open. "Daddy, where will my room be?" The fork nearly slipped from my hand. For 1 second, the entire room froze. Angela's eyes flashed toward Eric, and he gave her a subtle shake of the head, a signal to cover the mistake. Angela's voice came quick, too quick. "When we visit Grandma Honey, we'll just stay in the guest room." But her eyes betrayed her. It wasn't a visit they had in mind, it was occupation. I looked around my table at the plates I had polished, the cloth embroidered by my mother's hands, the silverware Frank and I had bought the year we married. I remembered another Sunday years ago when Frank had stood in this very kitchen laughing as he burned the bread, his arms wrapping around me as if he had all the time in the world. That memory glowed warm in my chest, and the contrast was unbearable. Now I saw only strangers seated where my family used to be. Eric lifted his glass to his lips as though nothing had happened, but I caught the way his gaze wandered, measuring the length of the wall, the height of the ceiling, the square footage of what he already believed was his. And something inside me, something I had buried beneath decades of sacrifice and obedience, stirred. I smiled outwardly calm, as if I hadn't noticed the tremor in Lily's voice or the slip in Angela's facade. I laughed politely at Eric's half-hearted jokes. I passed the gravy. I played the part of the agreeable mother. But inside, my silence shifted. It was no longer the silence of defeat. It was the silence of a storm gathering strength. By the time the dishes were cleared and Angela's perfume lingered in the hall like smoke after a fire, I knew the truth. They weren't just circling. They were moving in. And if I wanted to survive, if I wanted to hold on to myself, to Frank, to every memory stitched into these walls, I would need to stop pretending not to see. That night, when the house was empty again, I sat at the table staring at the empty chairs. My hands trembled, but not from fear. It was rage, sharp and cold, wrapping around my bones. I whispered into the silence to Frank, to myself, "They think I'm gone already. They think this house is theirs, but they've forgotten this house has teeth, and so do I." The Sunday dinner lingered in my chest like undigested food, heavy, sour, impossible to shake. I told myself maybe I was imagining things, maybe grief was twisting my judgment. But then came the evidence, one small shard at a time, sharp enough to pierce denial. It happened one evening as I cleared the dishes. Angela had left her purse on the dining room chair, half open, its contents spilling out like a carelessly guarded secret. I reached to tuck the flap closed, a small courtesy, nothing more. But there, folded neatly between a cosmetics pouch and a leather planner, was a large sheet of paper. I pulled it free, thinking it might be a receipt, a flyer. It was neither. It was a blueprint, my blueprint. The outline of my apartment drawn in precise lines, annotated in Angela's looping handwriting. Knock down this wall, open kitchen to living room, master bedroom, Eric and Angela. I froze. The paper trembled in my hands. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It wasn't just a thought in their heads anymore. It was a plan, inked, measured, labeled. My sanctuary had been reduced to lines and arrows like it was already theirs to redesign. I slid the paper back, careful not to leave a trace. I washed the dishes with hands that shook the clink of porcelain too loud in the quiet kitchen. That night, I didn't sleep. Every creak of the apartment felt like an intrusion. Every shadow on the wall reminded me that I was surrounded not by family, but by vultures circling overhead. The days that followed only sharpened the picture. Mrs. O'Leary, my neighbor across the hall, leaned on her walker one morning and whispered to me in the elevator. "Your son was out on the balcony yesterday, pointing down at the street like a real estate agent. Said this place would make fine office space." She chuckled, thinking it a harmless exaggeration. But I felt the floor drop from under me. Then the doorman, a kind young man who always carried my groceries up, mentioned casually, "Your daughter-in-law asked if she could get an extra mailbox key. Said it was to help you, Mrs. Henderson." He smiled, but my own did not return. I had never asked for help. The warnings came faster, a letter from the bank, an alert that someone had tried to reset my account from a new device. My Social Security number had been used, they said, but the attempt was blocked. I sat on the phone with the bank representative, my heart pounding in my ears, trying to sound calm while my mind screamed. When I finally opened the folder where I kept my most important documents, my worst fear crystallized. The original deed to my apartment gone. The copy of my will missing. I stared at the empty space in the folder as if it could explain itself. My fingers traced the indentation where the papers had once rested warm from decades of my careful protection, and now they were gone, stolen under my own roof by my own blood. The betrayal was no longer hidden in smiles or polite suggestions. It was written on blueprints, whispered in hallways, attempted in bank logins, etched in the absence of what was mine. I sat at the kitchen table that night with the documents I still had spread before me, the lamplight pooling over their edges. My reflection stared back in the darkened window, tired-lined but not broken. Not yet. I whispered Frank's name. They think I'm weak. They think I'm blind. My voice was steady, almost frightening in its calm. But I see them now, every step, every lie. And they will not take this house. They will not take me. The silence that answered me was no longer oppressive. It was an ally. The quiet before the storm I knew I would have to unleash. The empty folder with its missing deed haunted me like a coffin without a body. Proof of theft, but no way to scream it aloud without sounding like a paranoid widow. I knew if I faced Eric head-on, he'd smile, twist my words until I was the one who seemed unbalanced. That was his gift, manipulation dressed as concern. So I did what I hadn't done in years. I picked up the phone and dialed Clara Johnson. Clara and I had been friends since college. She had been a lawyer, sharp as glass, the kind who could slice through lies with a single look. Though retired now, she still carried that steel in her voice. When she answered and heard my silence on the line, she said only, "Tell me everything." We met the next morning at her kitchen table, the smell of strong coffee and lemon polish wrapping around us. My hands shook as I laid out the surviving documents, the bank letter, the story of the blueprint, the missing will. Clara didn't flinch. She flipped through each page, her brows knitting tighter. Finally, she looked up. "Martha, they've already started. This," she tapped the folder, "isn't just family greed. This is fraud. And worse, it's premeditated." She pulled out a magnifying glass, examined one of the signatures on a copied form Eric had once asked me to sign just in case. Her eyes narrowed. "This is falsified. He forged a power of attorney. If you hadn't caught this, they could have transferred the deed already." I felt the room tilt. My son's handwriting, clumsy but confident, stared back at me. The boy who once drew crayon suns and stick figures was now scripting my erasure. Clara reached across the table, gripped my hand. "You need protection. And you need proof. I'll connect you with Daniel, a colleague of mine. Young Hungry specializes in property scams like this. He doesn't scare easily." 2 days later, Daniel came to my apartment. He wore a navy suit too big for his frame, but his eyes were alert, quick, never missing a detail. He shook my hand firmly. "Mrs. Henderson, if they think you're alone, they're already underestimating you. That's our advantage." And so, the plan began. I became the actress in my own home, smiling, nodding, playing the role of the gentle, oblivious mother. I let Eric pour me wine, let Angela chatter about Lily's school projects, let them believe I was lulled into their script. All the while, my phone recorded beneath the table. Every slip, every comment about when we move in, every sigh about our future kitchen, I captured it. Daniel showed me how to back up the files, how to timestamp photos. Together, we built a silent archive piece by piece until it was undeniable. The most jarring moment came one Thursday morning. I returned from the market to find 2 strangers standing in my living room. Angela beamed, gesturing toward the walls. "Don't mind them, Martha. They're interior decorators just taking a look." I stared at the measuring tape stretched across my dining room, the man jotting notes about the square footage. My knees almost buckled. Angela spoke as if this were normal, as if my home were already hers to redesign. But I smiled. I smiled so wide it frightened even me. "Lovely," I said, my voice smooth as honey. "Let me get you all some iced tea." In the kitchen, my hands trembled as I set down the grocery bags. I placed my phone on the counter, pressed record, and whispered, "This is evidence." That night alone, again, I listened to the muffled voices on the playback. Angela's laugh, Eric's muttered approval, the decorators listing costs. Proof. Every word proof. I looked around my apartment, the walls pulsing with memory. Frank's shadow seemed to lean in close, whispering in the quiet, "Don't let them take it." And I promised him then, as the recording stacked in my phone like bullets in a magazine, this would not be a story of surrender. This would be a war, and I was ready to fight it. The decorators' footsteps faded, but their echo clung to my walls like mildew. That night, sitting at the table where Frank and I had once celebrated our anniversaries, I stared at the blueprints, the recordings, the missing documents. Proof of betrayal was not enough. Proof doesn't stop thieves, it only exposes them. Clara's words rang in my head, "Don't confront, outsmart." So that's what I did. With Clara's counsel and Daniel's diligence, the counterattack began quiet, deliberate, disguised as surrender. I kept smiling at Eric's jokes, nodding at Angela's suggestions for modern lighting. But behind the curtain of normalcy, I was dismantling their fantasy piece by piece. Daniel introduced me to Sophia, a young buyer from Madrid, new to Boston. She wanted space history character, not another glass box in the sky. My apartment, with its red brick oak floors and lace-curtained windows, was exactly what she had dreamed of. She sat across from me in Clara's office, her Spanish accent lilting as she said, "It feels alive." I told her the truth part of it, that my family wanted me to give it up, that I needed this sale done quickly and quietly. Sophia nodded without hesitation. "We do this fast. They will never see it coming." The papers were drawn, the account prepared. By the time Eric was measuring walls for his future office, the home no longer legally belonged to me. It belonged to Sophia, and he didn't even know. I felt almost giddy watching him pace the living room with a tape measure muttering about knocking down the dining wall. Angela trailed behind, flipping through fabric swatches, tossing her dark hair back, as if she already owned the place. "Mom, picture this," Eric said, gesturing with both arms. "Open space, a little bar here, sleek cabinets. Doesn't that sound better than this old setup?" I smiled. Oh, how I smiled. "You're probably right," I whispered, my voice sweet as molasses. "We'll see." Inside, my chest burned with a quiet fire. Meanwhile, Clara and I visited the notary. I signed my new will, every stroke of the pen, deliberate, final. Eric and Angela were cut out, entirely stripped of everything they thought they were circling, like vultures. Only Lily remained my granddaughter, the one innocent in this web. But even her inheritance was sealed away, not to be touched until she turned 25, old enough to know the value of love and the cost of betrayal. That night, I began the ritual of leaving. Not dramatic, not noisy, just piece by piece, like sand slipping through fingers. I opened the cedar chest Frank had built with his own hands. Inside were the artifacts of our life, the silver frame with our wedding photo, his worn leather journal, the cassette tapes of his voice reading bedtime stories. I lifted each one, pressed it to my chest, and then packed it carefully into cardboard boxes. No one noticed when I carried the first box out disguised as a bag of trash. No one saw the second tucked beneath old coats. Slowly, the soul of the apartment was moving with me, while Eric and Angela still planned their paint colors. One evening, Angela stood in the kitchen sipping coffee from my favorite porcelain cup. She waved a hand at the cabinets. "Once these are torn out, we can really breathe in here." I nodded, even as my heart pounded. That very morning, Sophia had wired the final payment. At that exact moment, legally, the kitchen, she dismissed the walls, she despised the home. She mocked it was hers, not mine, not Eric's, Sophia's. But I held my silence. Because silence was the sharpest blade I owned. I stacked the last box in my bedroom, taped it shut, and sat beside it in the dim light. My body trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of what I was doing. For the first time in years, I felt powerful. Not because I had shouted or fought or pleaded, but because I had chosen my battlefield. And this time it would be mine. The ink on Sophia's contract was barely dry when the day finally came. A Thursday afternoon, the kind that smelled of cut grass and distant rain. Eric had called earlier that week, his voice brimming with a false sweetness. "We'll come by Thursday to start moving things. Don't worry, Mom will handle everything." I said nothing more than, "All right." By 11, Clara and I were parked across the street, sitting low in her sedan with tinted windows. My boxes were already gone. My life, what mattered of it, was safe in my new place. All that was left here was the shell they thought belonged to them. At 1 o'clock sharp, Eric's black SUV pulled up. Angela stepped out first in designer sunglasses, her phone already in hand as if she were documenting a victory march. Eric followed, carrying tools, his stride confident like a king returning to claim his castle. Then they reached the door. The lock had been changed that morning. On the wood taped firmly at eye level was the sign Daniel had printed, "Private Property. No trespassing." Angela's laugh rang out shrill, confused. She tugged at the handle. Nothing. She tried again, harder, her manicured nails scratching against the brass. "Eric," she snapped. "What's going on?" Eric pulled at the handle, jamming his shoulder against the door. Nothing. He dialed my number. The phone buzzed in my purse, unanswered. From the car, I watched the unraveling. Angela's confusion curdled into panic. She pounded her fists on the door, her shrieks rising. "Open up. This is our home. You can't do this." Her sunglasses slid down her nose. Her face blotched red. Eric stayed quieter, but his jaw clenched. His phone glued to his ear as he called again and again, as if the sound of ringing might restore the control he believed he had. Clara's voice was calm, almost clinical. "Let them scream." Silence cuts deeper than argument. And she was right. Watching them crumble in broad daylight, denied by nothing more than a lock and a sign, was a vengeance. I never had to lift a hand to deliver. But Angela wasn't done. By that evening, her rage had found a new stage. Facebook. The video was shaky, her mascara streaked from tears. She sobbed into the camera, claiming she and Eric had been betrayed by me, their own mother, that I had been manipulated, that I had sold the family home in secret. Eric appeared in the background, holding Lily like a prop, his face a mask of sorrow. The caption read, "When greed destroys family, pray for us." Within hours, strangers were clawing at me with words sharper than knives. Cruel, heartless, senile, ungrateful. They cursed me in comment threads, accused me of abandoning my family, of being scammed. They mourned with Angela, a woman who had never shed a real tear in my presence, but could summon oceans of them for an audience. And then the phone calls began. One was from my sister Joan down in Florida. Her voice cracked with fury. "Martha, what have you done? Everyone's calling me. You've humiliated this family. How could you throw your own son out like a criminal?" I closed my eyes, gripping the receiver. Joan had always been one for appearances, for keeping the facade polished while rot spread beneath. She didn't want the truth, only silence that kept the peace. But I had learned silence could serve another master. So I gave her none of my story, none of my defense. "Believe what you want," I said flatly, and hung up. That night, I sat in the glow of my desk lamp, scrolling through Angela's post, my fingers cold against the mouse. I didn't delete, didn't respond, didn't plead. Instead, I saved everything, screenshots of comments, copies of the video, every text dripping with accusation. Proof, I reminded myself, not noise. Let them scream. Let them curse. Let them try to bury me beneath their lies. Because beneath the silence I held, I was building a fortress stronger than their rage. And in that silence, I knew I had finally won the first real battle. Angela's video burned through Facebook like wildfire. By the weekend, local reporters were calling sniffing for scandal. And soon, there it was on the front page of the Boston Herald, "Boston Mother Disinherits Son Sparks Family War." My name, my face, my story reduced to a headline for strangers to consume. They painted Eric as the heartbroken son, Angela, as the wounded wife, and me as the bitter old widow gone mad. Reading it, I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I folded the paper, placed it neatly on the counter, and poured myself a cup of coffee. If they wanted a war, they would have it not in the court of gossip, but in the court of law. Eric moved quickly. He hired a slick young attorney named Mr. Collins, the kind who wore tailored suits and spoke in sound bites perfect for reporters. The lawsuit landed like a stone on my doorstep, a petition to declare me mentally unfit, manipulated, incapable of sound judgment. He wanted guardianship. He wanted control. He wanted everything. Clara and Daniel were ready. The day of the hearing, I dressed carefully, navy dress, pearl earrings Frank had given me on our 30th anniversary, hair pulled into a neat bun. I wasn't going there as a victim. I was going as myself. The courtroom smelled of wood polish and cold air. Reporters waited outside with cameras' flashes bursting as we entered. Eric sat at the plaintiff's table, eyes fixed ahead, Angela whispering furiously beside him. Mr. Collins smirked, radiating confidence. I sat across from them, hands folded, my expression calm. The proceedings began. Collins painted his picture, a lonely, grieving widow tricked into selling her home, manipulated into cutting off her own bloodline. His words dripped with rehearsed sympathy. Mrs. Henderson, he said, pointing at me, is no longer the capable mother she once was. She has been deceived, and if the court does not intervene, a lifetime of family legacy will be destroyed. I didn't flinch. When it was our turn, Clara rose. She moved slowly, her voice measured her presence, commanding even in her retirement. Your Honor, she began, this is not a case of confusion. This is a case of exploitation. And we have proof. Daniel took over laying out every piece of evidence like bricks building an unshakable wall. The audio recordings of Angela discussing when we move in, photos of the blueprint labeled with their names, bank alerts tracing attempted fraud, witness testimony from Mrs. O'Leary, frail but fierce, on the stand. I saw that boy, her son, showing the apartment off like it was already his. Shameless. Each word tightened the rope around Eric's lies, but the climax came when Clara nodded to me. It was my turn. I stood my knees steady, my voice clear. Your Honor, I want you to hear something in his own words. I handed over the voicemail recording an accidental message Eric had left weeks earlier. The courtroom fell into silence as his voice filled the speakers. She's old. She'll break soon. We'll take everything. Gasps rippled through the room. Colin's smirk evaporated. Angela's face drained white. Eric's jaw clenched, but he didn't look at me. The judge leaned forward, his gavel tapping once, sharp as a gunshot. There is no evidence. Mrs. Henderson is incapacitated. On the contrary, there is overwhelming evidence of coercion and attempted fraud by the plaintiff. The petition is denied. Furthermore, a restraining order will be issued. Mr. Eric Henderson is to have no contact with his mother without prior legal approval. It was over. Eric sat frozen, the weight of the verdict sinking, like lead. Angela covered her face with her hands, trembling not from grief but rage. Collins gathered his papers with the stiffness of a man who had already begun calculating his next client. I walked out into the September air, the reporters shouting questions, the flashes blinding. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. For the first time in months, I felt the ground beneath me solid steady. My silence had spoken louder than their lies, and I knew then this war wasn't just survival, it was victory. The courthouse doors closed behind me, and with them, the weight of months of deceit and humiliation. But victory, I discovered, is never loud. It is quiet, steady, like a tide that has finally turned. Within weeks, I left Boston. I didn't want the echoes of Eric's shouting or Angela's staged tears lingering in my walls. I moved north to a small cottage by the sea in Maine, white clapboard siding, a porch that smelled of salt and pine windows that opened onto the endless horizon. For the first time in decades, I could breathe without fear that someone was trying to measure the air I inhaled. I filled the garden with lavender, mint, and jasmine plants Frank once promised we'd grow when life slowed down. Every morning I walked barefoot through the dew, the earth cool beneath my feet. I sat with my journal, writing pages not of anger, but of remembrance. It was there one misty morning that the first letter came. A plain envelope slipped through my mail slot, the handwriting uneven, childish. Inside was a drawing, a yellow sun, a crooked house, and 3 figures holding hands. At the bottom, scrawled in crayon, "To Grandma, I miss you. Lily." I pressed the paper to my lips, tears hot but silent. She was the only one who hadn't betrayed me, though her innocence had been used as a weapon. I pinned the drawing above my desk, a reminder that some threads of love can survive even the sharpest scissors. Not long after I met Pastor Michael, the local minister, a man with silver hair and kind eyes that seemed to hold both sorrow and wisdom. He came by with a loaf of bread, saying, "Welcome to town, Mrs. Henderson. If you ever want company, the church is just down the road." I didn't answer right away. Faith had always been Frank's comfort, not mine. But later, when loneliness curled around me like fog, I walked into his chapel. We talked not about God at first, but about betrayal, about silence, about how survival can harden a heart. He listened without judgment, and then he said something I never expected. "You've defended what was yours. Now what will you give?" The question unsettled me, but it stayed. Weeks later, as I watched the waves gnaw at the shore, I knew my answer. I met with Clara one last time and rewrote my plans. Not only had Eric been cut out, but now a portion of my assets would form a fund for women like me, older women trapped, silenced, stripped of dignity by the very families they had once sacrificed for. A refuge, a lifeline, a legacy. That night I wrote in my journal, "Frank, I kept the house." But more than that, I kept myself. And now what I couldn't give to our son, I will give to women who still need the strength to walk away. This is my inheritance, the freedom to say no, the courage to remain whole. As autumn bled into winter, the air grew sharper, the sea louder. I sat by the window each evening, wrapped in a shawl, watching the sun sink into the water. The silence no longer frightened me. It was no longer the silence of betrayal or absence. It was the silence of choice, of freedom earned. One evening, the lavender in the garden caught the last light, glowing violet against the darkening sky. I closed my journal, placed Lily's drawing gently between its pages, and smiled. Because at last I understood they could take my name, twist my story, even try to erase my mind. But they could never steal this quiet, this dignity, this unshakable peace. And in that silence, I was free.